All right, and there we go. So welcome everyone to our Q&A with author Drew Hayes, who is speaking with us today all the way from, I'd say sunny Texas, but I'm not sure how
For
sunny
the
it is
moment.
today. Sunny Texas, there we go. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge where we're each speaking from. Here at the University of Winnipeg, we are in Treaty 1 territory, and we are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples. We are also on the homeland of the Red River Métis. We in the English department recognize the role of the English language and English as an academic discipline in contributing to the historical and present formations of settler colonialism and imperialism in Canada and around the world. In expressing this land acknowledgement, we commit ourselves to engaging with, questioning, and challenging these formations in ways that support the decolonizing work being done by Indigenous peoples and allies in Manitoba and elsewhere. Drew is speaking with us today from Collin County, Texas, which was originally settled and occupied by the Caddo, Wichita, and Comanche people. While displaced from their traditional lands, these tribes remain an important part of the culture and communities of Texas and South Central United States. So I'd like to start by thanking Drew for joining us today. For those of you who are semi-familiar with his work, I know everyone from my popular literature and film class is going to be pretty hecking familiar with this beauty. But a brief introduction, and I will use Drew's official bio because it's too good to pass up. Drew Hayes is an author from Texas who has written several books and found the gumption to publish a few so far. A few is understatement, but he graduated from Texas Tech with a BA in English because evidently he's not familiar with what the term employable means. Drew has been called one of the most profound, prolific, and talented authors of his generation, but a table full of drunks will say almost anything when offered a round of free shots. Drew feels kind of like a D-bag writing about himself in the third person like this. He does appreciate you're still reading, though. You're welcome. To provide a little bit more context, Drew is the author of the Villains Code series, the Superpowered series, the Spell, Sword, and Stealth series, and the Fred the Vampire Accountant series, as well as a number of standalone texts. He's the founder of Thunderpear Publishing and releases his texts as ebooks and print through Amazon. So thank you so much for joining us today. I feel a little odd sort of doing an introduction when we've been chatting for the last 10 minutes, but it's all good. Wanted to sort of jump right into some questions because as you saw earlier, we got some really great questions from the class and from the community. Are we having mic problems? Do you want to?
I had accidentally left myself muted, but luckily caught it in time.
Sweet. Okay, perfect. Well, with that, I guess the most obvious thing to start with is sense of humor. So for Forging Hephaestus, for Villains Code, you're looking at superheroes, you're looking at morality, you're looking at corporate structures, you're looking at justice and power, and all of it is really hecking funny. So why did you opt for that sense of humor for serious issues? And are there particular characters you'd like to associate more of that humor with? Or do you want to just sort of have, when you're writing, do you try to make sure everyone has that kind of playful element?
Well, I think humor really works in a large tonal space. There's an author I grew up reading a lot who, when people ask for more child-friendly versions of my book, I always just say, go read Gordon Corman, because he is outstanding, he was foundational, and his books are appropriate for a younger audience, whereas mine are not currently. Maybe one day, but nothing I have written. Language alone is kind of an immediate deterrent there. But that was something that always really stuck with me, was the way he did characters and the way he did humor, infused even in kind of tense situations sometimes. And that the way that it could come and go, it didn't have to define a scene. I liked that. I felt like I tried to carry that with me. Humor, I also feel really is appropriate in a lot of tense action-y situations, which I write about because, when people get stressed, when they get tensed, when they get afraid, it's not an uncommon feature for people to try and lighten things for themselves, for others around them. Often when people get tense, that's when they joke. And so I do feel like a little bit of that is just sort of a natural, it works in, when you're having a lot of action, tense set pieces, there's a natural flow of humor there. So far as every character being humorous, I do think that every character has the potential for humor, but I don't think they're all, or at least they're not all meant to be funny in the same way. Like Ivan's humor, I think Ivan is a hilarious character,
Oh,
but
he's wonderful. He's
he's
absolutely wonderful.
he's never in on the joke. Like his deadpanness is what makes him so funny. Whereas, Johnny Three Dicks is clearly putting on, like his name tells you at the outset that what he's doing, what he's saying, it's all very intentional and meant to provoke.
Yeah.
And so, you can have a lot of different types of humor, but maybe not all from the same character.
Well, and Balam is always the butt of the joke. We were reading in class last week, the sarcasm is not recognized at council. The first time I read that, I think I laughed out loud, which was, yeah, I think I was in a public space and I just couldn't help myself. So yeah, that playfulness and that idea of tension, given that you're working in these sorts of like superhero narratives, we often think of as being very, very black and white, and you very actively disrupt that. You're playing a lot with gray morality, and so to sort of carry on with that idea of tension and action, how does why gray? Why do you want to muck up that sort of simple moral framework where Superman is the good guy and Lex Luthor is the bad guy? Why are we mucking with this?
There's there's a lot of reasons, but from the minute I kind of decided to focus on villains, I knew it had to be a gray morality. People like villainy to a point. And that point is basically Kristoff.
Yeah. Oh,
which
fantastic.
is why he's
Sort of,
in that guild, is he sets a very clear expectation out of the gate that yes, these are bad people, but they're not bad people. Like the fact that he is there and welcomed kind of establishes that, look, we're bad guys, we're not monsters. And that I think is a really important line if we're going to be on board with this organization, because you can see the individual characters. We know Tori and Beverly and Ivan, we know they have reasons for why they're not going to the side of justice, but as a greater organization, there's just not a way to spotlight everybody all the time. So Kristoff was sort of a way to establish as a general, like, these people aren't good, but they're not absolute, just unredeemable monsters. And I think you kind of just have to do that when you're doing villains, because you can't write pure villains. Like, you can't write the real true sociopath horror like things. I guess you can, but that's a different kind of book. And I didn't want to write that kind of book.
That's not quite the tone you were going for. So I guess I'll interrupt and say, why villains then?
I think villains are a fascinating thing in the comic book world, because I often feel like they get a little bit underutilized. For one thing, I had just spent 8 years writing about superheroes. That's probably an important thing just from a creative standpoint to establish.
You needed to change over because Superpowers was massive and probably
Still
pretty encompassing on your side of things.
It took me 8 years. It was about 1.5 million words, 5 books, and I loved it, but I definitely was ready to not write about superheroes, but I do still like comic book worlds. In fact, I did Forging Hephaestus was the third version of this story. There were 2 drafts that got above 50,000 words that I had to junk because they weren't working. And the reason they weren't working is I was trying to do what I had done with Superpowers and make it a realistic world. And as soon as I threw out that sense of realism, as soon as I said, okay, it's comic books, everything's on the table, there's no sense of balance, scale, or fairness, it just is what it is, and they have to deal, and it was just there. And I was like, oh, this is what I was trying to do. But villains specifically, I'm I'm fascinated by how badly they're often done in comic books from a realism standpoint. And to be more specific, like if the world is about to end, Doctor Doom does not get to sit on the sidelines. He lives here. His
Yeah.
stuff is here.
Yeah.
He has stakes in that fight.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what's always bothered me is like every time the world is ending, reasonably speaking, at least some of the villains should be like, hey guys, like, I know we're not cool, but come on.
Someone needs
And
to stop this. We should all try to stop it. Yeah, that kind of
right.
vested self-interest, as it were.
Exactly. It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Like again, even if it's only for a global catastrophe, those still happen enough that it really should foster some sense of dynamics between them. I really wanted to explore that idea, a world of villains with a baseline of pragmatism. And sort of constructing what that would mean and how that would work is how the villain's code came into being, because I was trying to, find a system by which it could exist naturally.
Mhm.
And yeah, that was sort of what I found, and I really liked exploring that concept.
So, what defines a villain then? Because a monster would be whatever Kristoff is handling and getting rid of, but what would define someone as villainous?
I think honestly that is a question that most of the villains either have to answer for themselves or in the process of answering. I don't want to over spoil things, but Bones of the Past, the sequel to Forging Hephaestus, is largely kind of about that question. Victoria has graduated from the guild at the end by this book. Things have settled down, and Ivan kind of talks to her and says, one of the challenges that we face is that we have so much freedom. You have to decide what you want because you can do almost anything. Like, not in the sense that we tell kids you can do it. Like, no, you have the resources and the wiles and the connections that there's really not much you can't have or do. It's
Yes.
a question of what you want and what you want to be.
Yeah. So, pursuing that freedom makes someone villainous, or what's the?
That's the thing is I think it's sort of I think everyone is in that guild for different reasons. Like, I don't want to over spoil for Bones of the Past, but Ivan is not in there for. Ivan did a lot of killing, but not necessarily for bad reasons. But at the end of the day, someone with Ivan's record is just not going to be a superhero.
Yeah.
You have people like Beverly, you have Tories, you have people like Chloe who just don't want to be associated there, who sit on the fence entirely.
Yeah.
You have zealots who were let down by the systems that were supposed to protect them.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of reasons why they go to that guild, why they become villains. And that's, it sort of comes down to what their motivation is individually, what they want out of life, and what paths they're willing to take for it.
So thinking about all of these different peoples, these different perspectives, one of the things that I particularly enjoyed, and a number of my students were commenting on, was the access that you give us as readers, that third person perspective, and the fact that we're able to move around so much. How do you maintain voice for that diverse a cast? Because you've set us up in a third person perspective, but then that means that we're dealing with an absolute cacophony of different ideas. How do you keep those all clear and sort of keep those voices separate while you're working with that third person space?
A little bit spreadsheets. I love a spreadsheet. I have a spreadsheet of notes I'm looking at right now.
Yep.
But I don't know. Truthfully, that might be just something I have a little bit of a knack for, is I've been able to find the character voices fairly from jump. I started off doing third person omniscience and honestly never really looked back. I have one first person that is done because I really felt it was necessary for that character.
Yeah.
But predominantly I like third person omniscient. I like the ability to tease things that the characters themselves don't know. As far as keeping the voices straight, I don't know. I put a lot of thought into the individual characters, into what they want, into what they are going to be.
Mhm.
And so I don't know. I think by the time they hit the page, there's enough there that I can usually lock in on who they are.
And so I guess to sort of to push on that a little bit, when you're working with that many voices, and why not give us like just a deep dive into Tori? What are we getting that's different about what do we get about Ridge City because of that third person sort of breadth?
Oh, well, for this one, even if I didn't default to third person omniscient, I absolutely would have had to do it for this series,
Yeah.
because it is meant to be evocative of comic books in so many of the framings and stuff.
Yeah.
And just like you would have 5 different series running across the same world that would then maybe interconnect into one big event. That's kind of the sense I was going for off of, you want your superhero story, you want your older story about the more experienced villains, you got your Tori story. And Tori is the main thread, but she's the launch title, and then you have your secondary series that are kind of launched afterward.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely, I feel like that's essential if you're going for that comic book feel, that expansive world.
That it had to have that intersection. It had to have that sort of numerous spaces. Awesome. Okay. Um, why Hephaestus? How did you come up with Hephaestus for Tori? And you mentioned that you sort of had these voices once they hit the page, you had a sense of who they were. What what about Tori screamed, Greco-Roman?
Honestly, she ended up with that pretty much the exact same way she did in the book.
Yeah.
I was racking my brain for a villain name for her for a long time, and then at a certain point, I was just like, okay, what do I know about Tori? She's made of fire. She likes to build stuff. She lives in a basement. I'm an idiot. Uh,
So there was an organic element to that. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Tori's journey of like, oh wow, this is right there, isn't it? Was a little bit reflective of my own. Boy, Drew, you missed the forest through the trees on that one.
I enjoyed that it wasn't that you thought, hey, I could have this really cool villain named Hephaestus. What does she need to have? And it actually went the same way. That's delightful. Um, so you've mentioned comic books, you've mentioned sort of the larger superhero world and the irreality of it. Um, any specific inspirations for particular powers or particular characters? I know that as for any copyright, you always have to say this is entirely fictional, it's not based on anything. But just between us friends, were there particular things that you wanted to draw in because of a source or because of a story that you had loved or because of a person or things like that?
I mean, there's really no way to do a superhero story with all original powers. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
That
I,
is beyond the beyond at this point. Yeah, there's
yeah,
too much.
it's you have, and honestly, if I read a superhero story without the tried and true super speed, super strength, psychic powers, like the go-tos, I would feel like, well, this isn't really what I wanted. I wanted the superhero stuff.
Yeah.
So you have to accept a little bit of overplay in that one. That's just walking in the genre. But I've tried to avoid any direct things. I definitely made thematic borrowings, and I was very clear about, I think, when I made those. At the end of the book, Lodestar gets given a pair of glasses that she doesn't actually need. And that is not an accident, obviously.
Yeah. Well, and she mentioned she used to wear glasses when she was starting out as a way of trying to it's a hilarious cliche, but it's a good cliche.
Right. And given her morality and her center as the strongest, like she's clearly meant to have some thematic ties to Superman, even though power-wise they work very differently. They do have the baseline similarities, but that's I think if people who've read Ahead to Bones of the Past will know, there are some explicit differences.
Yes. Yes.
Um Ivan's, again, not to oversell things, but it was important that his be very similar to Lodestar's in a lot of thematic ways, but not quite the same. But much like the Lodestar, his is sort of a mantle thing. And I thought those two being similar was obviously pretty important.
Yeah, that we have that kind of parallel between these two figures and that balance as well.
Yeah. So I tried to pull like a little bit of theme here and there. There's a mention of a genius on an island nation they run called Tyranny, which you see a little bit more of her in book 2, I think. I actually just finished, literally it went out to beta readers this week, a book that's coming out this year called Villains Vignettes Volume 1, and it's a series of 3 novellas set in the Villains Code universe. And you actually do see more Tyranny in that one. So I was trying to remember where you get a little more peek of her.
I was going to say we only got a glimpse of her. There's sort of reference to, but not quite a lot. So I'm just sidetracking here because I'm very excited about vignettes. So Tyranny, who else are we getting?
Oh, I mean, that's just a little bit, but this isn't really a secret. My Patreons read the 3rd story as a bonus earlier this year.
Yeah.
But the 3rd one is a Christmas set one, and it kind of runs the whole. You get to see almost everybody. You get a little bit of time with most people, and you do get a solid Christmas adventure with Tori and Ivan going to the North Pole.
Okay. Well, so I'll have a new festive favorite to read each year. Awesome. Okay. Speaking of Tori and Ivan, because this is when this was a question submitted, I immediately jumped to this as somebody was asking what your favorite character dynamics are. I obviously am a huge stan of Tori and Ivan and their relationship. But do you have another, or how do you feel about that, or do you have others that are particular favorites?
Oh, I absolutely love Tori and Ivan. I really wanted to make clear, given the age difference in genders, like that it was non-sexual. That was really kind of core out of the gate. There's even a few people who make Bones of the Past jokes of, yeah, those two. I think the most I pulled from was Jack Donaghy and Liz Lemon for their interactions. I really felt like that was a good sort of tonal dynamic, at least in their early phases.
Yeah.
You don't see much of it in Forging Hephaestus, but I love the dynamic between Ivan and Lodestar. And I actually love the dynamic between Lodestar and Tori, which you get a good dose of in Bones of the Past. I like the counterbalance of Ivan on one shoulder and getting to hear what Lodestar's version of advice is.
Yeah. So within Forging Hephaestus, though, who's your favorite?
Sure.
Who's your favorite pairs? Because I agree. The Tori and Lodestar is spectacular kind of dynamic, but they haven't read that one yet. Well, many of the folks here haven't read it yet. So.
I love Thuggernaut and Johnny Three Dicks. Those two as just a buddy, good old odd couple, best friend combo. It's a solid one. Let's see. Oh, I really like Wade and Zealous. I wasn't sure how many people picked up on the kind of special relationship between them. But even when I got a beta reader back for the first time, and they noted that part at the end where he's explaining things, she's like, I'm really glad he didn't directly lie to her. That would have bothered me.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So I've got a question here, and I don't know if I necessarily want this answered, but I've agreed to put it in. Is Ivan going to get a redemption arc? Are we going to see more of a hero's journey for this particular character?
That is an interesting one. I know we are keeping to Forging Hephaestus, but knowing you've read Bones of the Past,
yes.
I do want to ask you, do you think Ivan needs a redemption arc?
I'm trying to remember if this was from Community or from one of my students, because I almost don't want to go too far against I don't know that he does. I think that the character actually has an incredibly rich narrative from what we get later, and I'll keep it as spoiler free as possible, because I have had a few students who have said, oh, I have to read the second one, and then I told them how many pages it was, and there was a chorus of
I should also mention that Amy Landon does an outstanding job on Audible.
Yeah, you don't write short books, and this is difficult for those of us with limited time. But yeah, I really felt that Ivan actually got an interesting arc, not in the hero's journey form, So I guess to sort of change the question a little bit, is a hero's arc important for these characters, or are you trying to do something different with the villain's arc instead?
That's fair. Honestly, I think the Ivan question is really fair given what you have to work with in Forging Hephaestus,
Yeah,
because without that additional context, that is an absolutely reasonable thing to wonder about.
yeah.
But I don't know that classic hero arcs are necessarily the right path for some of these characters. I think the option of it absolutely has to be explored. Excuse me, I gotta get a little water there.
No, not worried.
So I think Jesus, the option of it, the opportunity of it, it's a little bit things that are hinted at in 2 and in 3, but the conceptually making choices is a big feature of this book. And villains, you know, up to a certain point, Tori and Beverly at the end of book 1 haven't really done anything catastrophic. In fact, they've mostly been more helpful than hurtful. And, you know, they're not bad people. They're dipping their toes into this life of crime and villainy. There's a reason they're not starting off robbing banks in broad daylight or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that, you know, as they move deeper into the waters of villainy, there's also still the chance for them to switch teams. And even if they don't take it, exploring the fact that they have that choice and that freedom is part of being a villain. For Ivan specifically, he Ivan is a hard one to pin down. I will say I don't think Ivan is sorry, not for anything that has happened that was under his control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to say it. The things that Ivan has done by his own volition, he is not sorry for.
So he doesn't necessarily need to have a redemption arc if he's not seeking being redeemed.
At least not for his actions as Fornax.
Okay, cool. As warned, so this is Delphi. She be on camera. Sorry about that. So you were speaking to the spreadsheets upon spreadsheets earlier, and had some questions about your process. So how do you approach a new text or a new project? What is your organizational process? What does your writing process look like?
It honestly varies sometimes. Occasionally it will be I have an idea and I map it out and I kind of get a nice coordinated spreadsheet planted together, and then I write that one out. But that more often tends to be my shorter projects. Often my bigger ones, I will put down some general things that I need to keep straight. I like to do what I call checkpoint outlining for my bigger ones, which is I will figure out the main things that need to happen. You know, whether it's a big scene or just a character getting a key, but without the oh, what's the word for it? Without those core checkpoint things, the story doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And then I will usually write from checkpoint to checkpoint. So I like knowing where I'm going. I feel like that's really important for at least me as an author. Everyone has their own process, but I'm better with a direction. But I really enjoy that space between those checkpoints for the characters to find their own ways to spend their time, to find natural solutions. I feel like it's a good mix of script and improv.
So I guess to ask DM to DM, do you set up your characters and then run them through the space the same way that you would if you were doing like campaign design, where you have that kind of checkpoint system?
I think we DM with very different groups of players.
That will absolutely be true.
My rule for D&D, or at least for Authors and Dragons D&D, is that I never build more than 1 to 2 maps ahead, because
Chaos
that's just it's not a good use of anyone's time.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Oh, sorry if there's clattering on the microphone. One of the other cats is wanting some attention here. So you're going for checkpoints, but you also often create sort of these pivots or these twists or these reveals. How are you able to sort of, how do you set up the pacing for that kind of information reveal or that information release?
Honestly, I don't really have a finite way to determine that one. It's I hate to steal one of my grandma's cooking phrases, but you do it when it looks right. Pacing is often more a thing about feeling for me
Mhm.
than anything else. Like as I'm reading, I can say, okay, I need to let down some tension here, or I need to amp up to the excitement, or I need to lay a little bit of fear for this character who needs to, evoke terror later on.
Yeah.
And that's honestly really something I only find by reading and like then writing what feels like the next natural movement tonally. And sometimes I have to go back and move things around. I mean, it's
Yeah.
absolutely not a perfect process, but
Yeah.
yeah, honestly, pacing is one I just kind of have to do by feel.
Well, and given that, I mean, early superpowers, you were releasing chapter by chapter, so it's a little harder to necessarily be going back and making some of those shifts. So did that shape the way that you write?
I think so. I really try to have a rough draft that is technically publishable. That's just my first version. I really try to make coherent and good and done. But the upside to not working in serials anymore is that you can go back and tweak the foreshadowing and like really, it's easier in that sense.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I miss the dynamic that comes with a serial. I miss the interaction that you get. But unfortunately, once you transition into trying to make a living off of it, upholding that schedule and a publishing schedule, it's two bears, and you got to feed the one who pays rent.
that is the right bear. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I will say my partner is the one who found your work and would read it in a serial form, and I said no, I have to read it in because if I had to wait between chapters, no, you would have gotten some ragey posts on your blog, and you didn't need
Oh, I
that. So,
did. Oh,
oh
I
well, not for
assure you,
me.
I did.
I can't take responsibility for those. Those were not me, but I can understand how people would have felt that way. So I need more story. So the you've mentioned that publishing process and that sort of publishing schedule, and there were some questions about the fact that Thunderpair is its own, that's your press, that's your project. What does your publishing process look like?
So I should probably be upfront that Thunder Pair Publishing is mostly just a branding thing that
Yeah,
I do to unite all my titles.
yeah.
Um, please
I'm not
don't
saying you
picture
have
any.
an umbrella press and you have a staple of authors and you have a group of editors. I know this is your own project. So what does that look like for someone who wants to develop their own brand and
Um,
their own process in that way?
so if you want to, so my process is mostly indie writing.
Yeah.
And the only deviation from that is the Audible originals that I work with these days. Some of the early Freds were also traditionally published, but currently Audible is my only traditional publisher. So for the indie side, you will write your rough draft. You will submit to your editor, or I would recommend editors. As many as you can find, trust, and afford is truly that it's almost hard to do too many.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say at least two. It's not fair to ask one to catch every mistake.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, if you have the option of beta readers, if you're comfortable with beta readers, then after your beta readers, or then after your editors, you would send that out to beta readers. So that's where my Villains Vignettes is right now.
Yeah.
At the same time, you would need to work with a cover designer to get a cover made. I need to email mine actually, but I've
You're
got some
welcome for the
time on that
reminder.
one.
There we go.
So you need a cover designer to get that one made. You'll get that back. Once you have your finalized manuscript, if you are running a machine that has Vellum, which means a Mac, that is the recommended software for formatting your books. You're going to get clean, nice, and my God, easy. I started on this thing doing it with a Word file in a program called Calibre and having to manually shift around everything, and it was just so much work. Calibri is still out there and works well. You know, I don't want to run them down the road. God knows they got me through many years, but if you have the ability to do Vellum, do Vellum. And but if not, you can use Calibri and Sigil to create an ebook. You can upload that to Amazon via their KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing. Assuming everything goes through, you'll set your prices and you will be published. Audiobook wise, there are mostly two different routes to go on this one. If you're an indie author, and unfortunately, if you're a traditionally published author with a smaller press, you're probably, I don't want to say, but there's a good chance you'll be going through ACX, Amazon Creative Services. That's the indie version of basically Kindle. So you go on there, you can audition different narrators. You can try and reach out to them individually. You can post your manuscript. There is technically a royalty share program. If you're a new writer, it will be extraordinarily difficult to get someone to sign on for that, just because that's a lot of time investment from them, and you don't have any sort of track record, positive or negative, that proves that they can recoup that. So you're almost certainly going to be looking at paid per hour going through ACX, and you'll be doing quality control, you'll be reviewing everything, you'll be approving it before it posts, etc. And I believe the ACX rate is 40% if you don't do royalty share, so out of pocket. The other path is a audio publishing company. So the one I predominantly work with is called Tantor. They were the first ones to reach out to me for Fred the Vampire Accountant. They have paired me with amazing talents like Kirby Hayborn, Carl McCarley, Roger Wayne, Amy Landon, just amazing narrators I'm very, very lucky to work with. And I've really enjoyed all the time with them. I also work specifically with Audible, who do their Audible Originals program. This one is a little more specific. I don't, it's a thing they're doing right now. I don't want to speak about it as if it's an industry constant. But their Audible is doing a publishing branch right now where they're reaching out to authors with strong audiobook sales and publishing some of their books. The book I did through them first was called Secondhand Curses. Got me nominated for an Audie. Got to go to New York and meet the cast. It was really cool. So that's like 3 people doing an amazing job on that script. And then the one that came after that is I started the 5-Minute Sherlock series. And so those come out in audio first, and then 6 months later, they come out in print and ebook. So I think that's a pretty comprehensive rundown of indie publishing.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and hopefully folks will have been taking some notes as they go there. Have a question sort of related to this. You were speaking about beta readers. You were speaking about sort of some of that process. And there was a question of, because writers today have access to inputs and opinions from readers, do you read all of the posts on blogs, comments, communities? I know that, for example, Villains Code has an active subreddit that I enjoy. They have some good headcanon that I enjoy going on in there that we won't get into too far. Do you look to these sources for that discussion of your work? Do you engage with these sort of those posts and comments, or is that sort of information but secondary? Does that how does that shape your process?
I tend to look at most of those as reader spaces. Like that's a space for readers to be. I think I have interacted with the Superpowers Reddit a few times to post about things like upcoming cons and stuff. But even then, I ran it by the moderator first to make sure that they felt it was appropriate, just because I think it's important to have reader spaces, places where you can talk about the book, positive or negative, without worrying, is this going to impact the author reading this, assuming you're one of the 5 people on the internet who cares about other people's feelings.
Yeah, you don't want to make the author cry, so let's maybe phrase this nicely.
but it's different. It's not the same if you know that person might be reading it. I feel like so I try
Mm.
to leave reader spaces for readers. I have author spaces to interact with me. I have the Patreon that connects to my Discord. A&D has a Discord of its own. I have social media stuff. So there's no shortage of ways to interact with me if people want to. I don't think I need to go into their spaces for that.
So you would sort of make sure that you're focusing on the Patreon spaces and those kinds of dialogues
Yeah.
instead. Okay. And do you find that those spaces are a particular influence on your work?
Not especially. To be honest, I go in knowing where I'm going. My beta readers, I'd say, probably have the most influence
Mhm.
on my work because if they come back to me and say, all three of them are saying a point doesn't make sense or isn't clear or anything like that, then that's me saying, oh crap, I need to fix that. I mean
Yeah.
that is they're the front line, and if they have issues or if I'm not communicating clearly, that's the feedback that I'm really there for them, my editors, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So very much focused on sort of that the technical feedback and then let the readers engage with the work where they are.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Cool, awesome. And the last formal question we have, because actually we've been able to move through these quite effectively, which means we're about to hit the point where we hit free for all and people can ask whatever they'd like. So we're countdown to chaos. Maybe,
I
hopefully,
will
folks have some questions.
I will give a fair header warning. I don't do spoilers.
Well, okay, I don't have any questions, but everyone else so many things I'd like to know. The last question that got submitted was, how do you feel about fan interpretations? So, for example, someone making fan comic of your work. Is that something that you're comfortable with and in favor of, and seeing that interpretive process? Is that something that you would say, I'd like to keep control of the story and the characters that I've made? What are your thoughts on that sort of thing?
I mean, I have a lot of respect for fan fiction as it exists. Um, I don't I don't have any problem with people like writing in that world or working with that world for themselves.
Mhm.
I obviously, as a indie author who, has to both write and live off this, I
Yeah.
have to make sure that it stays mine. And unfortunately, with trademark rules, if you don't fight something, you sometimes lose the ability to fight for something. So
Mm.
um I have no issues with people like doing that for fun or
Yeah.
that sort of thing, but if it moves into profiting, if it moves into the sort of thing that infringes on copyright, then I have to be a bummer, unfortunately. But for the fan fiction made as fan fiction is intended, go nuts, have fun. I love that community, that's great.
So the transformative works and the headcanon narratives and those things, if it's for that fan space, that's all good.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly valid use.
Cool. All right. Um, well, there are a few things that I'd be curious to circle back to, but I do want to open it up at this point. And we actually have our first question already. Alibi
Woo.
has, or Debbie has jumped in with a question about forging Hephaestus and wanting to question how this text engages with media perceptions of villains and sort of how the public perception of villains articulated in the text. So does the text question the public perception of the villain? And if so, how?
I So if we're saying, does the text or the media in the text?
Does the text question how that public perception, or is
I
that is
gotcha.
the text playing with that concept of?
I think definitely it's playing with the perception of villains because we get to see villains kind of in their downtime. Ivan's whole character sort of is being the most unremarkable, bland, boring dad of a guy
Yeah,
who, has keeping this incredible secret. And
and a
that's
drawer full of phone charging cables. You know, you gotta balance those things out there.
Yeah, and that's the thing is it's looking at these villains when they're not actively doing the crime, and maybe spending some time with them and seeing what has perhaps driven them to this lifestyle. I think definitely part of it is looking more into the idea of villainy and what would push someone to reject systems for various reasons.
Yeah. So, do you think that that humanizing is part of that gray morality, the idea that we would think of people in sort of the certain roles versus seeing them when they're at home?
Oh, absolutely. I think food comes up a lot in my books, and I think that's not accidental. There's something very human about eating,
Mhm.
about seeing someone just make a sandwich,
Yeah.
whether they're a destroyer of worlds or just a regular person. We all have to eat. I sometimes joke that I show them eating so much because it would be uncouth to show them pooping.
Yeah, the shots of someone in a bathroom, we don't necessarily need that part of the narrative, but the certainly that idea of, and this is something that I've seen in a number of different forms of media where food is sort of disempowering. If you have a character who's obsessed with food, they're less authoritative and dominant. And so by showing them eating, you're sort of highlighting the humanness. Like when how often do we see Superman with a sandwich? And yeah, that's a really nice way of framing it. I mean, Ivan sounds like a great cook. So that
He is. Canonically, he is an excellent cook. And more than one person comments that's kind of weird.
it's an interesting thing for someone who hated God to focus on in his life, but he's made his choices, and that's pretty delightful. We've got a question from Jessica. Uh, do you prefer going into a series with a certain number of books in mind, like Superpowers, where there's that sort of structure of the years in Lander, or do you like the freedom of an ongoing story?
I will never go into a series with a set number again. I'm calling that out. I've said it before, I'll say it again.
Yeah.
Um, I I needed to do Superpowers the way I needed to do it for the college style. Like it was absolutely the right setting for that story. But when you lock in like that, sometimes you set up a situation where you get to your final book and there's so much story that you have to write a 460,000 word book that's over 60 hours long on audio and is so big you can't even make paperback versions of it.
Yeah, that book got a little.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a tome.
Hang on. Let me see if I can grab a copy here.
You can reach into the yogurt shop and
I can.
yeah.
Oh, can you? Yeah. Hand for scale.
Holy, wow.
Yeah. Sometimes people ask why there's no paperback. That is the reason. I physically cannot make one right now. The printers available to indie authors just no go.
That Yeah, okay.
So I enjoyed it. It was necessary for the structure.
I mean,
Never again.
yeah, and this is sort of the complexity of having so many different threads and characters and narratives. You needed all of that to bring it all together.
Yeah. It had to be that big to be a good book. Or at least to be the best book I could make it.
Yeah.
But never again.
We have a question. Brody is wondering what's the best piece of advice that you have received to help you get where you are now?
Goodness gracious.
I mean, we
That
could
is a
start with
tough one.
Grandma's advice of when it's done, but what else are we looking at?
I think honestly, just the concept of remember that you can fix a rough draft has gotten me through a lot of rough drafts. There is a point around usually the middle of a book where, and this is true of the majority of authors I've spoken to, you hate it. You are absolutely sure that it's going to ruin your career. It's the worst thing you've ever done. It's garbage. God curses you for putting it on the earth, etc. It's just part of writing for some reason. I don't know. The middle is tough sometimes,
Yeah.
but being able to say, well, that was absolute trash, but I can fix it in the edits. Lets you get through that point. And then when you go back and you read and you realize, okay, I was in my head. This wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was, but it can still be improved.
Yeah.
That ability to refine, I don't know, maybe it's something I appreciate more because I didn't start off having it, because I started through serials, but
Yeah.
just the ability to take a breath and say, it's a rough draft. That means it's okay if it's rough.
Yeah.
That'll get you there. The other one I would have to say is, and honestly, to be frank, this is one I give to people more than anything, but it's, you need to make a habit of finishing. There's a bad tendency among a lot of authors, and I've gone down this road myself here and there, of starting without finishing your books. And I understand there's a concept of not throwing good time after bad, but when you're starting off writing, you're basically starting off building those muscles.
Yeah.
It's a skill. It's not magic. It's a thing that the more you work at, the better you'll get. And the problem with starting 10 books and quitting at the midpoint is when you get to your 11th book and you do feel like you've got the momentum to finish, you have no practice finishing books.
Yeah.
And that's a different skill set than starting and running the climax. That's not to say that if you start something, you're honor bound to finish it through. Learning when to cut, and when to reformat. I mean, I mentioned earlier I had 2 versions of Forging Hephaestus that had to go in the bin,
Yeah.
but that was because I was able to look at them and say, this isn't fundamentally working, because I have the experience of finishing, and I know the difference between a book that I'm in the middle of and a book that just does not work.
It isn't gonna get the full length of the, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and finishing, not only drawing the story together, but also that editorial process, that revision process. If you don't have that practice, I mean, that's
Right.
we learning to edit and learning to revise are totally separate parts of that writing process.
Those you can at least offset a little bit if you're willing to spend on editors, but no one can finish the book but you. I mean, they can, but that's ghostwriting, and that's a different thing.
You need to be a slightly bigger name before you can start getting the ghostwriting happening.
Or I guess have a lot of disposable income, but
Also an option.
yeah.
We have a question about Fred the Vampire Accountant. What was the Pink Floyd song that was playing in the forest in the first book?
I don't think I ever said which one it was.
I think that's why Holtz is asking.
Yeah.
Did you have one in mind particularly when you were writing that scene?
That book is like 8 years old at this point, so I'm going to be honest with you. I can't offer much insights into the writing process there.
Fair enough. And you know, I'm trying to remember, or I'm trying to think of what Floyd songs would particularly go with that necromancy, but you know, it's that was, or sorry, it was domination, right? Control and domination. I'm trying to remember the exact mechanism. It's been a while since I've read that first book. Probably been a bit longer for you.
I need to go back and reread. I do one of those just about every year. Number 8 came out recently.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to, I think I'm behind a couple books, but I'm looking forward to those ones. Speaking of, oh, we got a question. Time by Pink Floyd was the apparently the correct answer.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
There you go. Guess we both do need to reread that one.
Yeah, I guess we do. So the I have a couple questions here on world building.
Okay.
And so not just thinking about characters, but the construct of, and you had mentioned you start off with Forging Hephaestus and it was trying to feel a little too real. And you kind of needed to throw that out a little bit and get into a sillier space. So were there particular authors or particular genres aside from comic books that you were using to create that kind of world structure and world building? And are there particular events or people that would shape the kind of worlds that you're creating?
I mean, are we sticking with Forging Hephaestus specifically?
I think we can go free for all. I think we're open here.
I mean,
if you want to speak specifically to Villains Code and like how you created that world, I mean, I would appreciate that because that's on brand for what we're doing. But
yeah,
that's
I can't really think of a lot of real world ones. I mean, I'm sure I have drawn from other authors in terms of like how I learned to write and that sort of thing, but For Forging the World of, oh, well, Forging Hephaestus, there we go. Truly, I really did try to focus as much on the sense of that comic book world, because once I found it, it felt so right. I really wanted to fold that in as many aspects as I could.
Yeah.
One of the, I think it's not as necessarily clear, but if you kind of read through the history in Villains Code, the generations of the world that have sort of existed previously are meant to mirror the, not a direct gold, silver, bronze age comparison, but so Professor Quantum is, and the Alliance of Heroes, that's the first kind of generation of superhero comics, which are pretty awful in a lot of capacities, if we're going to be honest.
Yeah.
There are characters whose names I don't feel comfortable saying.
Yeah,
Um,
there are some flaws there, and I really loved the little evocation of that with Whitest Knight. And there's sort
uh,
of a hat tip to questionable choices can be made, and that's when you get Lodestar going bonk in the temple. But sorry.
oh yeah,
So
and that's, I mean, that's her coming back as sort of a return to that only existed because she wasn't there.
yeah, yeah.
But so Lodestar kind of marks that second generational thing where you start to see a broader array of characters, kind of more inclusivity. You have a female main champion superhero, which is something that wouldn't have existed in the Professor Quantum Age. And then we get to the current one, which is the Tori Beverly generation, and sort of just like modern comics, it's meant to be a little bit more focused on multiculturalism, a broader variety of people and peoples. So like I said, I really tried to fold in the comic as much as I could.
Okay, so that era was shaped more of the world structure than any particular events or things.
Yeah, trying to give it a history that also felt like our comic book history, I guess is the way to say it.
Awesome. Are there, for other works that and other series that you work on? You mentioned Superpower very much had that kind of little pocket of heroes being trained in a fairly real world. While there was that sort of element of comic bookiness, why situate that particular series of texts in the real?
So this sounds like a ludicrous thing to say in the
Okay.
year of 2023. But you have to remember, I started writing Superpowered started writing around 2008.
Yeah.
So there weren't a lot of superhero options in 2008.
That is not the world we live in anymore. Most
No,
certainly. Yeah.
no. Like I said, this sounds like I am just talking out of my butt on this one. But there was a time when we didn't have a lot of great superhero content options, and I remember feeling very frustrated that I couldn't find something that focused on both the people and the powers. It felt like it was either exclusively soap operatics,
Mhm.
with no, interesting dynamics of the powers that could be used, or it was just all running, punching, with no exploration of the human consequences. And I wanted to try something that did both, and that was really my driving force. So my question of superpowers was trying to be, what if we had superhuman abilities in the real world?
Yeah.
And I guess probably the difference of Villains Code is that's more, what if we had realistic people in a comic book world?
Yeah, because the absurdity and the over the topness of Villains Code is a large part of its appeal. It's ridiculous, and that's quite fun. So
Yeah, anything goes. It's a lot more open scoped.
yeah. Well, the last question that we have in the chat so far is, I think, a fairly snarky one. What made you think or say that Ivan ate a god and then not explain any of that until the second book with a frowny face? So what about that particular hook was important for your narrative? I'll try to reframe that into a different kind of question there, Alex.
I knew it was a question people were gonna want some insight on. Like, you can't have a character as powerful and ill-defined as Ivan without offering a little bit of a hook.
Mhm.
But space was an insane premium in Forging Hephaestus. There is an entire main character team that had to get moved to the sequel. And ultimately that worked out, I think, better overall. But for those who've read Bones of the Past, the New Science Centuries were supposed to be in Forging Hephaestus. They were a plot element
Oh,
that was originally going to be in the first book.
how would you
And
have even fit that in?
exactly that I couldn't. I didn't.
Yeah.
That's and sort of for those who have gotten Ivan's full origin story, it needed more breadth than I had space to give it in Forging Hephaestus. It was more important for me to do that story well than to do it quickly.
Yeah. And so we focus more on Tori as that protagonist figure in Forging Hephaestus because it really is her story.
Right.
But then that hook of the very simple, well, I won't tell you all of it, and I ate a god, and then I think that's even the end of a chapter. Like it's
I think
just,
so too. Yeah.
oh
So you get Ivan's story when it's more thematically important to Tori's journey, is the authory way to say that.
yeah. So the next question that we've got is so in Forging Hephaestus, you have those large events, those sort of checkpoint elements to the narrative. Did you know how the last event would end when you were writing the earlier ones? Did the as you were writing, did you see a shift or did you see a change in how the story was going to resolve, or did you already always know this is where we had to be?
I mean, occasionally, like maybe details of how things go about might shift, but typically by the end, things are pretty locked in. Honestly, the endings often are the parts that change the least because the ending, if I've got a strong ending, I'm more likely to go back and revise my foreshadowing to move toward that ending.
Yeah.
So yeah, your ending is where everything is tying together. It's where everything is really paying off. That is my least likely point to pull a big change.
So the events in between, you can say, oh, well, this isn't really quite building, or that isn't. So those would shift more readily than
Well, yeah, those are
climactic.
naturally fluid, but
Yeah,
the checkpoint events,
yeah,
those tend to be static because they're pillars, like the story is kind of built upon them. So
yeah.
changing one is fairly onerous. I'm trying to think if I have any examples, but honestly, nothing that jumps to mind on that one.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh,
Um, sort of circle back to a bit more of the questions of the characters in Forging Hephaestus, and I'm going to kind of lean on you to do a little bit of the heavy lifting that I was going to be doing. After the lecture today, my students are going to be staying on for the rest of the Zoom. And so these are some of the course notes for today. So I'll get your input, and that way it takes some of the pressure off later. The two different systems of training are very distinct. We have the real world experience of the villains, and we have the marketing and sales of the AHC. Why that particular dynamic, and what was that commentary that you were trying to engage with there?
I mean, I think it's a awareness of public perception and how that plays into one's efficiency and I guess motivations. With the villains, we see that the first primary thing that they are concerned with teaching these villains is survival.
Mhm.
That is the core at the center of the code, is not screwing up, not drawing heat, but it all comes back to we want to live our lives in peace. And the first part of that sentence is we want to live. And so, they go right into danger. They get assessed on how well they can handle things, how well they can obey the code, because that is a survival mechanism for these villains.
Yeah, that's that fundamental element of their work. Yeah.
Whereas the superheroes, that is not their primary thing. I mean, even in their training, it's not really survival, it's protect. But you get to see the AHC as an organization that is funded by things like merchandising and natural kind of bureaucracy, red tape, that sort of thing. And I think you get to see that when money gets involved, there's inherent sort of compromises that come up even if you don't really think about them.
Okay, because and I was interested because you don't really show like Donald and Ren as sort of our keystone figures there. We don't really see them getting training out in the field the same way that we do with the villains. The villains have that on the ground, hands-on witnessing. Whereas Donald and Ren are told to hit the game controller and hit the gym. So I was curious about what that value set was speaking to.
Well, it's also, I think, we do get a little bit of their training later on, but it's a much softer approach.
Yeah.
It's build up some baseline abilities and then go out in teams and carefully controlled units. It's much more hand holding. It's much more making sure they're ready to fly before they leave the nest, as you might want from a superhero organization training new members. It's not the worst if they're given a little bit of extra safety net.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We have a couple more questions about for character descriptions, and particularly in Fred the Vampire. You generally lack in a lot of those sort of specific details. You give sort of glimpses of our character, but is that a conscious choice to sort of leave it open to the imagination? Is it that you want to be evocative of certain, more emotional than visual? Why is it you're so sparse with some of those details?
My favorite version of characters is when you just get a few key pieces and you can kind of put the puzzle together for yourself. To me, I think that's just a better, more fun way to mentally build your reading world. And so just as a writer, it's the style I lean toward. I think a few key features, and then you let the reader fill in that image in a way that makes sense for them, in a way that fits their world. I don't know. I think it's probably mostly a stylistic choice.
Cool. And you mentioned a few different times that sort of idea of the checkpoints and the pacing and the shifting. Once you've got your checkpoints in place, once you have the roadmap, do you write start to end? Do you write the ending and then fill in other stuff earlier? Do you write your checkpoints and then fill in the gaps? What's your order?
Oh, I'm a start to end writer. I've never been able to do the jump around. More power to those who can, but that is not my style. I got to put one foot in front of the other.
So just to try, and I'm assuming that's partially, I mean, you start off with serializing, and so you can't really write the middle section before the first section. But also, when you're speaking of that voice, is writing sequentially, does that help with keeping or building voices?
I think it helps with voice. I think it definitely helps me with pacing because I'm always feeling the flow from one chapter to the next. And so, it's a lot easier to say, okay, we really need to breathe here, or we really need to move here. And I think I would maybe lose some of that if I didn't have that connective tissue of going right. Because I read my chapter before I write the next one.
Yeah. And so that sense of constant
flow.
pacing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. I'll put out one more call for any questions at this point. If we have, sorry, there was someone at the door there. If anyone else have any questions here? Oh, we've got one more. Since you've written so many books on heroes and villains as a particular theme, do you still like reading these things? Are you sort of, you write about these things, but you read horror and murder mysteries? Like, what is this still a world that you can find involvement in the novel, even though this is a world that you're writing?
I definitely can. I can still read in the genres I write. I don't do it while I'm writing in the genre.
That seems like a good choice.
Just to avoid crossover stuff like that. But if I'm not reading in it, then I will. I also had trouble finding, not, I'm going to say good superhero fiction, but superhero fiction to my tastes. For a little while. There was a real bent on a sort of a gritty variant, surprise, given what we had going through cinemas and stuff. And unfortunately, I feel bad, but a lot of you who have seen more modern superhero media are just now getting the deluge of what if Superman was evil. That honestly, like that was the early 2010s in superhero fiction. It was bad.
Well, and not even the evil. I mean, we also have the Batman Who Laughed, which was a recent one, but I'm thinking of Red Sun, and what if Superman wasn't all about truth, justice, and the American way, but actually had different political values. There were some neat things there.
No, that was an actual a good examination. This
Yeah.
was just a lot of stories of like it's a superhero world, but the Superman is secretly evil.
And I think we're going to see more of that with Kill the Justice League coming up with the Suicide Squad game. But yeah,
Yeah.
these are places we kind of maybe need to keep treading, and maybe we can also build on. Question about your potentially your authorial mask. Which character in Fortune Cooke Festus reminds you most of yourself?
Oh goodness.
And I will note there is an and why that follows up after this. So if you just blurt out Arachno Bro, we're gonna need some explanation on that one.
I see. My often running joke is my only real self insert was Thunder from Pairs and Perils. Um,
Okay.
boy, I guess if I'm, it's hard to say. Like all have little individual their traits, but not necessarily flow from me. Um, really, if I'm being honest, the only one that pops to mind is Johnny Three Dicks because he just keeps a running commentary and kind of refuses to take things seriously. He is acting as the livening up agent whenever possible.
Yeah. So that evocative and disruptive force is something you like.
It certainly can have comparisons drawn to me at a bar.
Good to know. The next question on staying sort of on the mainstream superheroes and what we're currently seeing. Are you enjoying the current movement in superhero narratives? Do you have a preference for some of the older stories? And you were mentioning that sort of the gritty, trying to be grimdark superhero narratives of I guess that would be Bronze Age. I'm trying to recall where exactly that would fit in our overall. But what are your thoughts on the current mainstream superhero narrative market? And do you have a preference for this versus earlier forms?
I mean, there's definitely good stuff all around. I do of course hold a special place in my heart for Christopher Reeves as Superman. Um, I thought about that one a lot when trying to do the Lodestar scenes. There's a famous story of the director writing the word verisimilitude on a chalkboard as, this is what it has to be. This is what we have to aspire to. And I think that one you really feel it in that particular film. It comes through, and that's core to those Superman characters is you have to believe that they are genuinely good, that they genuinely care.
Yeah.
So, much absolute respect to that one. In modern stuff, I mean I followed the Marvel phase 1 through whatever Endgame was 3.
I believe so, yeah. I think
Yeah.
we're on 72 at this point. So.
Yeah, I walked that with most people. I assume like a lot of folks have been kind of trailing off in the recent one. I loved WandaVision, but I was a latchkey kid raised by TV who loved Nick at Night. So honestly, that one felt a little targeted right at me. Yeah,
There was some really neat stuff, and WandaVision was more experimental, whereas it wasn't the big blockbuster stuff. So
yeah.
I'm enjoying how they're moving into more of that experimental stuff now that they've done the sort of big 3 phases. This also might just be where things go entirely off the rails.
I would love more character work stuff. Like that sort of thing. I so one of my things I like to say is I have my style. One of the ways I describe my writing style is I try to find the mundane within the magical. Um, I really like putting these fantastical beings in mundane situations. If I can make a werewolf have to go to the market to buy carrots, I will.
Well, or if you have an accountant who becomes a vampire and stays an accountant.
Exactly. Yeah. I just think there's something really, really fun about that. I like to cite the Dragon Ball Z episode where Goku has to get a driver's license. Like I could have a whole series of that, of just the most powerful man in the world having to do stupid mundane things. I think I lost the thread on that one. Sorry.
Not a worry. We're just noticing we've got a couple more questions here. So what we'll go with you're in favor of a Marvel up to the end of phase 3, and then we'll
Oh,
see what
right.
happens.
Yes, and that one was fine. I haven't really kept up with most of. I watched Peacemaker. Peacemaker was very enjoyable. I mean, that one really felt like James Gunn said, "All right, here's a character no one wants more of, and I'm going to make you love him."
I mean, they started with John Cena. It's a pretty good place to begin from, but
Honestly, his I think his acting career mirrors his wrestling career a little bit. He started off overhyped, but he kept putting the work in, and now he puts in honestly good showings.
and of course, we're running short on time, which is why I've now got a flurry of questions showing up, which is brilliant. So we've
Lightning
got
round.
some on some related media, like are you a fan of My Hero Academia, and do you have any thoughts? Um,
I have to be aware of it. I have had a lot of people reach out to me saying, "Hey, you wrote Superpowers. Have you seen this?" And given the time frame when both of those came out, it's very clearly just parallel thinking. I don't imagine for a second any of you really thought that one's, but it's been asked enough that I like to get out in front of that one.
yeah.
Thank God I published when I did, and I have those copyrights, because otherwise I would be sunk.
Yeah, there
Uh,
would be some questions about motivation and inspiration, and
Absolutely. I mean, I think looking at it's very clear we watched a lot of the same influences, but took the stories in very different ways. But yeah, basically when I saw My Hero Academia, I was like, well, probably no Superpowers animated series for a while. Not that it was really, and no one was working on it or anything, but
no, but good to be aware of the market, and yes, there's interest, but that's currently being filled. Okay.
yeah, it's like, okay, villains code only.
um, so building on that question about what character do you see yourself in for Forging Hephaestus, you mentioned your only real self-insert has been in Pairs in Peril. What do you think about other authors in self-insert? Is there is that something that you think of as a good habit, or would you say that's potentially salting the text?
I tend to go into my books thinking, you need to build the characters that work within the situations they've come from, that work for the story you're trying to tell. I wouldn't really want to feel beholden to any specific character traits for the sake of them existing when they don't function for the story.
Mhm.
I've never really built from people in my life. I might steal a phrase here or a trait there, but there's no real parallels in my books to me or people, again, except for the thunder joke.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And I think we're going to go out on one last one because unfortunately we are running short on time. Um, do you have any relationship headcanons for your own characters that never see the page?
Um, hmm. I guess there were like I've had potential plot threads that I entertained but ultimately didn't go down, and I wouldn't say I consider those headcanons because they didn't come to be.
Yeah.
I think probably the closest is I sometimes know that relationships go deeper than I've let onto the page.
Yeah.
Ivan and Helen, even when you get to the end of Forging Hephaestus, it becomes clear that there was a lot more going on than was necessarily made explicit.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think I might know if something goes deeper, and I haven't put that on the page yet, but
Yeah.
generally speaking, if it's canon for me, I put it as canon on the page.
So you would say that anything that is more of that narrative dark matter, that sort of the stuff that exists beneath the narrative, like beneath the plot points, but you're aware of those relationships, you're sort of cueing, but that you wouldn't consider that to be sort of apart from the text then.
Yeah, I would consider that more foreshadowing.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Um, so I'm afraid we had a couple more questions dipping into the Marvel universe and other superhero spaces because, of course, we all want to talk about superhero spaces. But I would just like to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today and answering these sort of widely ranging questions about villains and heroes and morals and media and all of that fun stuff. If I can, I'll say on behalf of the Pop Lit and Film class and those who were able to join us. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for your expertise and your delightful stories. And I think you may have a few fans who are going to be seeking out some of these other books and other texts that you've written. And yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to turn off our recording at this point.